Suppose we can get started. Okay, so welcome everyone to another ECOP Wednesday session. Oh, there we go. So my name is Virginia Morejon. I'm one of the Young Ambassadors, and I'm also a PhD student at University College Dublin in Ireland. So just as usual, just to go over some housekeeping rules. So please make sure that your name is clearly entered, that your microphone is muted unless you're speaking, but also raise your hand if you would like to say something, or you can also use the chat function if you would like to leave any comments or ask any questions. And very importantly, please be respectful and use appropriate language. So a few words on the ECOP network. So as you know, it has been established by previous EMB Young Ambassadors and the Secretariat as of October 2024. So the network has been formalized as part of the EMB, and this with the goal of the EMB to continue to provide ECOPs with opportunities to network and to meet peers across Europe, and also to increase their voice at the EMB level. So I'm excited to introduce today's speaker, María Del Camino Troya. So María Del Camino is actually from Ecuador, just like me, and it's quite nice to have another Ecuadorian here since we can be quite rare in this part of the world. But anyways, María Del Camino brings a wealth of experience in marine policy across Europe with a particular focus on sustainability in the fisheries sector, and that's what she's going to be discussing with us today. So without further ado, María del Camino, we're ready for you whenever you are.
Great. Maybe you
Okay,
can put up the
yeah,
presentation.
so I'll do that. Just one second. Okay. Can you see
Great.
them?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, good.
Yeah. So today I'm going to be talking to you all about bridging sustainability in fisheries and exploring innovative solutions and advocacy for a resilient blue economy. So the reason I find the topic very interesting is that fisheries are vital for food security, livelihoods, and biodiversity. And one of the key issues is that sustainability needs to be secured to balance environmental, economic, and social needs. If you can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so as Virginia mentioned, I have marine policy experience for 7 years in Europe and Latin America, covering like actual policy in the government of Ecuador, research at UCC Mari in Ireland on EU research projects, and then most recently I was working also on EU research projects on the marine sector, but from a consulting company called Submariner Network. And now I am transitioning into a role in renewable energy. So we can go to the next slide. So as I previously mentioned, fishery sustainability is key for food security, coastal livelihoods, and biodiversity. We have to recognize that fisheries policy is heavily contested at a political level, and it's not always driven by the best available science. I'm sure all of you work perhaps in the management sides of things, are very familiar with maritime spatial planning or the development of marine policy. And a lot of the times, fisheries is treated very separately in the management regimes for oceans management, which has caused like a fragmentation in how fisheries are managed and the issues that then there will be at a political level, which I will discuss later. So in the next slide, I will walk you through the challenges in fisheries sustainability. So the main ones being environmental pressures, so that overfishing and habitat destruction. Then there is the issue with climate change, changing the fish stock distribution, like less big fish, less available stocks. And then in general, marine biodiversity laws, which then affects the availability of fish because some of their habitats are destroyed or some of the food that they eat is also gone. Then the other key challenge is socioeconomic pressures. So we have an issue with small scale fisheries declining and then generational renewal, meaning that the amount of young people entering the industry is low because it's not as attractive in terms of all the policy restrictions and how the economic potential of this industry is much smaller. Then you also have the market and trade challenges, in which illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing is a big issue. And that is also in terms of traceability gaps. And here we can also see the problem of policy fragmentation causing issues with the management of fisheries. So for example, in the case of Ireland and in Europe, usually you do maritime spatial planning, looking at the traditional sectors like shipping, offshore wind planning, etc. And like fisheries is always treated as an afterthought. Like even for in the case of Ireland, the department that's in charge of marine planning, it doesn't have the remit for fisheries. So that in itself causes like a lot of issues in terms of developing good policy and implementing it. And then like the common fisheries policy, which is the European main piece of policy, is also not doesn't communicate very well with these other types of directives. Then the third component is the political complexity of fisheries. That fisheries is not really done in terms of the best available science. Like if you're doing a stock assessment, that's not necessarily what will influence the quota allocations and such. For example, with the common fisheries policy, this was purely political negotiations based on the concept of traditional and historical fishing rights. So just let's say like for a couple generations, the French fished in a particular area, and that's why they still have those fishing rights. And that was not based on stock assessments or like environmental monitoring, shaped by industry lobbying and these political negotiations. For example, in the case of Ireland, when they ascended into the EU, one of their main losses was fisheries because of how the common fisheries policy works and like the quotas that were allocated to other member states that they could fish in Irish waters. And then we have this big issue of balancing sustainable fisheries policy with economic interest. So you have this new generation of environmental policy that looks to restrict fisheries, but a lot of the time these are not doing a proper socioeconomic impact assessment on these restrictions. For example, it's very contested in the Mediterranean, like the banning of bottom trawling and MPAs, like the fisheries lobby is bringing forward cases against, for example, the Spanish government and the EU, saying that these types of bans are not proportionate in the effect that it like completely cuts off a community from this fishing. For example, right now there's areas in the Mediterranean of Spain in which they can only fish for like 10 days of the year. So that's like a huge issue. Then another issue in political complexity is not only the influence of industry on fisheries policy, but also the influence of NGOs, because a lot of the times you have the fisheries lobby saying that the NGOs are funded by these oil companies and renewable energy companies to cut them off so that they have this specific hidden agenda. And recently there was a review put forward into looking at specific NGOs that the EU was funding when they should not be funding advocacy. So then another aspect is calling for transparency in fisheries governance, particularly at RFMOs, because usually these negotiations are happening at closed doors. So you might have the fishery stock assessment and habitat mapping in paper, like the scientific assessment, but then the way that the quotas are allocated, this is done behind closed doors. So for example, when you have an RFMO meeting for like IATCC, which is the Inter-American Tuna area, you will have like a delegation of 30 people coming from France and Spain from the private sector, and you'll have very little representation from the countries that actually manage this area or it's under their remit. So that's something that needs to be addressed, calling for more transparency in fisheries governance. So we can move on to the next slide. So then we look at what can we do? What are some innovative solutions that can be brought forward to improve the situation? So some of these are, for example, low impact and selective fishing techniques. So there you would go on to modify your gear, promote co-management practices. So there are, for example, types of fishing gear in trawling that have much less of an impact on the benthic environment. And then with co-management is where you would include fisher folk and fishermen into the management of a marine protected area. That way you can get more buy-in. And a lot of the times the fishermen know the fishing grounds so well that they know the status of the environment and can provide really good information on that. Then another aspect that can really help through innovation in fisheries is the digitalization and traceability tools. So one of the main concerns with fisheries is that you have full traceability from vessel to plate to know where your fish is coming from so that you know that it's complying with environmental and human rights regulations. And this can be done through AI and blockchain that provides you this traceability. Like you might be familiar with Marine Stewardship Council, like they will have a label, and in some cases you can scan it and see which RFMO area it was fished, what the name of the vessel was, etc. But this is not necessarily something that's happening with all of fisheries products. And then there is this company that's called Global Fishing Watch, which is very innovative. They started around 8 or 9 years ago, and they are mapping um, all the vessels, particularly fishing vessels, to see where they're at across the world, where they're fishing, what they're doing. So, and that's all open source data. So, like for example, an NGO or a government can see where like a vessel is doing port of call or if they're doing a transshipment. And so, by having visibility on what's happening at sea, then you can like develop policy or inform your management positions. And now Global Fishing Watch is also branching out to other types of marine activities, and they have a really nice tool that's called Marine Planner. So you can look at all the different activities so it can inform your MPA management and such. And then we have another concept that's called multi-use of marine space, which looks to address fitting in all the different economic activities that happen in the ocean, particularly in the Baltic and North Sea, which are very congested. So they will try to do, for example, biodiversity mitigation measures or biodiversity improvement in the scouring of an offshore wind farm. And in the case of fisheries, it would be interesting to explore like regenerative production of aquaculture to diversify seafood production. So you can provide, say, mussels from aquaculture rather than just relying on wild caught mussels and such. And then we can move on to the next slide that we will talk about advocacy for a resilient blue economy. So the main aspects that you can advocate for are integration of technology, the generational renewable, and the balancing advocacy and transparency. So why does the advocacy matter? Because stakeholder engagement ensures that policy reflects real needs. Because a lot of the time what's happening is we have people in Brussels, very far from the ocean, perhaps never been on a fishing vessel, creating very ambitious policies such as the EU Green Deal, or other types of policy that's restricting fisheries, and they don't really understand what fisheries is like, because it's a very complicated industry. Like, I don't know if any of you have gone on a fishing vessel, but it's very hard work. Like, the occupational hazards are really hard. Like, having compliance in labor rights there is very hard just because of the nature of the work. And so the people in Brussels don't really understand that, especially in some NGOs, they don't understand that as well. So also by doing science-based decision making, you have improved governance. So if you advocate at the Brussels level, say at the PESH committee, and bring forward like scientific advice, you might be able to push for better stock management that is based on scientific data and not just the data that like industry might cherry pick. Then another interesting tool is the EU Transparency Register, which is a tool for monitoring lobbying influence. So it's trying to map out like what different organizations are doing lobbying at the EU level, what the name of the people are, what the budget are, and that gives us more transparency, which is very much needed in the fisheries industry. Then another key issue is the generational renewal part, which we need policies that facilitate young fishers access to quotas, vessels, and training opportunities to keep the industry competitive and innovative. Because it's happened here in Ireland that post the ascension to the EU, a lot of coastal fishing communities are empty, like the vessels have been decommissioned. It's no longer a sustainable livelihood for people. And that's something very, very sad to see because this has been part of their cultural identity for centuries, for generations, and it's hard to let go of that. And if you're saying, okay, let's restrict fisheries, what's going to be the future of those coastal communities? And the same holds true for the Mediterranean, in Spain and in France, and even in some parts of the North Sea. So a lot of the time we are sold this idea of fisheries being these huge trawlers, but it's not really the case. Like there's a lot of small scale fisheries in the EU. Then some examples of advocacy policy work that you can have is through coalition building. I previously worked in the EU-IEU coalition, which was made up of Oceania, the TNC, Environmental Justice Foundation, and Pew, and they were brought forward to advocate on the better implementation of this European legislation to prevent and deter IUU fishing. So there you see how a group and network of NGOs can work together to do lobbying at the Brussels and international level versus just having one specific NGO work on that. Then some interesting tools that you can use is EU-funded projects. I was recently working in Blue Connect, which is a EU-funded project that looks to improve MPA effectiveness through stakeholder engagement. So, for example, in the Gulf of Cadiz, talking to fishermen to monitor and assess the development of MPAs and what might work best. And then another issue that I would like to highlight, which I mentioned before, is promoting transparency in RFMO decision-making process because we're not really sure what's going on through the back doors, like how the quotas are being allocated, and if it's true that, for example, that tuna stocks are actually very healthy, which is what the industry tells you, and that's why there's continued tuna fisheries, but we don't know if that's actually true. And then I wanted to finish up to start a conversation in the next slide about what I could see the role of ECOPs in sustainable fisheries if you wanted to get involved in having a career there or basing your research there. So I would encourage you to engage with decision makers and industry stakeholders because if you stay in say, the comfort of your research center, you're not really getting a true life scenario of what it's like to work in fisheries. So it would be very good, like if in your research project you do a little field trip to Brussels to try to meet with people from the PESH committee to see how scientific advice is used in this committee and with MEPs. Then with industry stakeholders, having to learn about how these different advisory councils work in Europe. For example, for Ireland, you have the Northwestern Waters Advisory Council, and that advisory council looks at the Celtic Sea and the North English Channel. So it's made out of 5 countries. So these advisory councils would, in theory, make the best policy recommendations based on fisheries data. So that's another way you can get engaged, like try to do an internship with a advisory council and meet with someone from there. That's another avenue to get to industry. And then industry, it's hard to get them to talk to you. It's hard to get them to talk to you because it's very reserved, very much like a boys' club. But if you try and you just get a buy-in, like it will help your career if you want to work in that. Then I think science communication is key, and that's across all of marine science. Policy implementation, being able to get these key messages from the research of, say, an environmental impact assessment or the impact of offshore wind sonar on marine life, and like having some clear communication points to give to policymakers so that they can understand how the marine policy research works. And then the next one being again to support calls for increased transparency. So really engage with stakeholders about the importance of transparency within fisheries, why it's needed. And then lastly, I think one very interesting opportunity for the newcomers and who are just starting the research is to look at the technology-driven solutions. As I mentioned before, blockchain and artificial intelligence that can be really useful in for the traceability, for mapping out what's happening at sea, and everything like that. I think that really covers everything I had to say, and I wanted to open up the floor to specific questions people might have in terms of how we can secure this future through cross-sectoral collaboration, promoting equity and inclusion in ocean governance, using data-driven innovation for compliance and policy development. Because depending on the background of people who are here, we might be able to take the conversation in a different way or um, look at the other points from before. Next slide, please. So yeah, that's everything I wanted to share with you. My email's right there. So I think we can open up the floor for questions now.